Pride Fighting Championship closed in 2007, fans savored the prospect of Japan's best coming to the UFC, and no debut was more anticipated than kickboxing ace Mirko Cro Cop. Cro Cop was the first Pride superstar to set foot in the UFC, only to become one of the biggest case studies for what can go wrong in the octagon. Welcome to the INC, and this is the story of Mirko Cro Cop in the UFC. During the early 2000s, Mirko Cro Cop Filipovic was one of the most feared men in MMA. Named due to his role in the Croatian Special Forces, Cro Cop made his MMA debut in 2001, having already built an acclaimed kickboxing career that saw him become one of the top K1 fighters in the world. Cro Cop took to MMA immediately, building a 21-4 record including wins over Mark Coleman and Igor Vovchanchian, and becoming notorious for his high kick famously described as right leg hospital, left leg cemetery.
High kick and down goes Igor! He is out!
Cro Cop's finest moment came in 2006, where wins over Vanderlei Silva and Josh Barnett saw him win the Pride Openweight Grand Prix and stake a claim as the second best heavyweight in the world behind Fedor Emelianenko. As questions about Pride's future started to go public, Cro Cop was immediately linked with a move to the UFC. At the time, the company's heavyweight division was soured by poor matches and a lack of fan interest, and hopes were high Cro Cop would be the knockout artist to reignite the weight class. Cro Cop was officially announced as a UFC fighter in December 2006, and quickly booked in a match with Eddie Sanchez at UFC 67, with Cro Cop entering the fight as the biggest bookmaker favorite in UFC history at the time. Cro Cop would finish an overmatched Sanchez in the first round, but came under fire from media members for his struggles cutting Sanchez off in the cage. Cro Cop later admitted his lack of preparation fighting in a cage was a big factor in his UFC run. Fans, however, ignored the warnings, and in April 2007, Cro Cop was given a #1 contender match against Jiu-Jitsu black belt Gabriel Gonzaga. Although Gonzaga entered the fight unbeaten in the UFC, many felt he lacked the striking game to pose a threat to Cro Cop, who again entered the fight in Manchester as a substantial favorite. Gonzaga would prove the doubters wrong, taking Cro Cop down early and hammering the veteran with punches and elbows from the top, before turning the MMA world on its head at the end of the first round.
Mirko looks tentative though. Oh my God!
I cannot believe that!
Incredible head kick knockout!
The knockout was a devastating blow to Cro Cop's stature. The heavyweight division's premier striker was finished by a grappler using his own trademark move, and in doing so, placing questions over the legitimacy of Pride's roster. Luckily, reputation was the only damage Cro Cop suffered in the knockout, as the Croatian made a surprisingly quick turnaround to take on Czech Congo at UFC 75. A battle of kickboxing specialists was mired in controversy, as Congo repeatedly struck Cro Cop in the groin, but was never penalized by referee John McCarthy. Congo going on to win a forgettable fight by unanimous decision. Having suffered straight losses for the first time in his career, Cro Cop called time on his UFC tenure, having increasingly grown at odds with the company over financial disputes. Cro Cop spent 2008 competing for Dream, an upstart promotion founded by former executives of Pride, where he returned to form with wins over Tatsuya Mizuno and Hongman Choi. Regardless, it's his brutal no contest with Alistair Overeem that's etched in the memory of most fans.
Like you said, it's the universal language, love and a kick in the groin.
With his voice now 10 octaves higher, Cro Cop returned to the UFC in 2009. Over the following year, Cro Cop enjoyed his best run in the octagon, winning 3 of his next 4 fights, including a rare submission win over Pat Barry. But a combination of injuries and weak performances against poor competition left many fearing he would never return to his Pride-era dominance. Those fears came to fruition when Cro Cop stepped in on short notice to face former champ Frank Mir at UFC 119. Cro Cop and Mir went on to have one of the worst main events in UFC history, with both men lacking intensity and failing to land any meaningful strikes of note. And by the start of the 3rd round, commentator Joe Rogan began openly mourning the fallen Croatian.
Yeah, this is not the Mirko Cro Cop who knocked out Alexander Emelianenko or Igor Vovchanchin or Vanderlei Silva. This is just not the same guy.
Mir would finish Cro Cop in the final stages of the fight, but UFC bosses were so upset with the match, they refused to pay Mir a knockout bonus despite being the only knockout of the night. Things would get worse for Cro Cop. One-sided losses to Brendan Schaub and Roy Nelson moved his UFC record to 5 wins and 6 losses. Having lost his aura and battling several knee injuries, Cro Cop seemingly called time on the sport. Do you know what's shorter than a second? MMA retirements. And 14 months after his match with Nelson, Cro Cop returned to MMA for the IGF promotion in Japan. 3 wins from his first 4 fights showed fans the Croatian still had much to offer, despite entering his 40s. And with the UFC needing a headliner for their event in Krakow, Cro Cop was brought back to the company for a 3rd time. Appropriately, Cro Cop's opponent was his old rival Gonzaga, who despite remaining a heavyweight staple, never came close to matching the level of his win over Cro Cop 8 years earlier. The opening stages of the fight proved similar to the first, with Gonzaga controlling the fight on the ground, but Cro Cop showing much improved resilience to neutralize his opponent's offense. By the middle of the 3rd, Cro Cop had begun reading his opponent's takedowns, rocking Gonzaga with elbows in the clinch before claiming the most satisfying win of his MMA career.
Cro Cop smells the end. He knows it's coming. Gonzaga's struggling. He has this. It's not the fight. Cro Cop settles the score in Poland.
Cro Cop was briefly linked to a match with Anthony Hamilton at Fight Night Seoul, but was later given a 2-year USADA suspension after admitting he used human growth hormone to repair a shoulder injury, with the UFC immediately terminating the remaining bouts on his contract. Cro Cop spent the rest of his career competing for Rizin, winning his 6 fights with the promotion prior to a brief stop in Bellator, where he avenged his loss to Roy Nelson, before being advised to retire after suffering a stroke in the weeks after the fight. In many ways, Cro Cop set the template for a failed UFC run, a combination of age, injuries, and a lack of cagecraft. But it's a testimony to his success away from the octagon that fans forgive this dark point of his career. Cro Cop will go down in the record books as a mythical and enigmatic fighter, the type that'll most likely never be forgotten. This is the INC. Support the channel on Patreon.